Let's pray. Father God, we come to you this morning as your humble servants. We come wanting to learn more about you. We come wanting to know who you are and what you have declared about yourself through your word. Lord, I pray now that every word that comes from my mouth would be your words. And anything that is not of you, Lord, would fall to the ground. That my brothers and sisters would be edified, that I'd be edified, and that your Holy Spirit would rule and reign here in this place in Jesus' name. Amen. After that worship, I have to tell you, I was kind of like, well, we should just kind of keep going. And to borrow a phrase from a younger brother of mine, it was like a total glory bomb. Like, I was over here like, oh, Lord. So I apologize in advance if this is anticlimactic, but here we go. So one of the hardest things Charles asked me to teach this week, and one of the most difficult things about jumping in, is the question of what in the world do I talk about, right? This is a big book. There are lots of great things to talk about, and when you're not teaching through a book, that question of, man, do I talk about this? Do I talk about that? Lord, so, there's a lot of prayer involved. And after praying about it, I decided to just kind of look into a question that had really interested me as we've been going through the book of Acts in our small group Bible studies. And so in Acts, we see, the works of the Holy Spirit through Paul and through the apostles. And one of the things that has kind of fascinated me is we've seen that Paul, every time he goes into a synagogue, he breaks open the Bible and he starts teaching, and he teaches about Jesus. And we hear about the Bereans in Acts 17, where they go back to the Scriptures and they check to make sure that the things that Paul was teaching were accurate. But the Scriptures that they had back then are not the same as the Scriptures we have today. The New Testament was still being written. He couldn't go back to the book of John, for instance. He couldn't go to the book of John. The book of John didn't exist. They couldn't confirm the events of Jesus' life through the Word. So, what gospel was Paul preaching? What was the substance of that gospel? This has been a question I decided to look into. Typically, when we preach the gospel today, we go to John 3:16 and those things, and Paul didn't have that, and so that's what I decided to look into. Paul's gospel had to have come exclusively from the Old Testament. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the gospel as it was preached. We're not going to get through the whole thing. I dove into this. It is such a huge topic that I only made it a part way through, so we're going to start. But I want to start by talking about the Bible that Paul had at his disposal. It was the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. Many of you will be familiar with the Septuagint. And what the Septuagint was the Hebrew Scriptures, what we refer to as the Old Testament, translated into Greek. And the reason that this is important, and the reason that this has piqued my interest, is because we know for a fact that everything in the Septuagint was written down and codified in history no later than about 130 years before Jesus was born. So that gives us a marker in history, so that when we read the prophecies that came out of that book, when we read the things that were written down, we know that they were written down before Jesus came to the earth. That makes the prophecies that much more powerful. That makes the promises that much more powerful. A lot of people today, and even back then, they'll criticize the fulfillment of prophecy. It's like, they could have gone back. They could have rewritten these things. But it's a matter of historical fact that's objectively provable that we can go back to this document and say, this was written down as of 130 years before Jesus ever came onto the scene. And this isn't merely academic. I don't want this just to be like a cool little lecture and you go out of here and your head's full of knowledge that you'll never really need. We talk to people every day who challenge the validity of the things that we believe. Every single day, we have friends, we have family members, we have coworkers who probably, hey, that's nice, that God thing you do, that's really nice, but that's not for me. And as we talk and persuade them, the same way that Paul talked with them, persuaded them, these are things we can point to. We can say, well, you may want to consider this because this was predicted and it came true. Paul saw the gospel as a legacy that was passed down. In the book of Ephesians, he talks about it this way. This is from chapter 3. Of this gospel, I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given me by the working of his power. To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. This was something that Paul had received and that he saw as his job to pass on. And not only his job, but the entire church's job to pass on. So that's where it hits home for us. We're part of that legacy. This story that we're going to talk about this morning is our story. And he gets very specific about this when he's writing to Timothy. He says, "You then, my child," this is in the second Timothy, it's the very last letter that Paul wrote. "You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that's in Christ Jesus. And what you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." So again, the idea of legacy. If we don't know the whole counsel of God, we won't be able to pass it on. So let's get started. To give myself a starting point, I looked at a couple of public messages that Paul made. One is in Acts 13. That's his public sermon to a group of Jews and God-fearing Greeks in Antioch of Pisidia. I took a couple points out of there, and then I traced them back to the Old Testament. Another main source of what we're going to be talking about today is his message to the philosophers in Athens in Acts chapter 17. I'll be making reference to those chapters, but you don't feel the need to turn there. So Paul, in his preaching, he had different audiences, and he spoke in different ways to different audiences. To the Greeks were clueless when it came to the Hebrew God. And the story that we have is very much about Jehovah and the Hebrew God. And so Paul had to do a little catching up with the Greeks. So we're going to start with the very basic elements of Paul kind of introducing the Greeks to Jehovah. And really, it comes down to a question: can anyone know anything about God? And if so, how do we know it? And as Paul walked into Athens, he saw, as you'll remember, an idol, a monument that was dedicated to the unknown God. And very much as in that day, today, we have people who will freely confess, "I believe in God, but I don't think we can really know anything about him." That's the agnostic viewpoint. I believe that there's a higher power, but as far as what we can know, I'm not so sure we can be confident in that. And Paul starts from this place. He starts by saying, "I notice that you're very religious, and you're so religious that you erected a monument to the God that's unknown." And he said, "Let me introduce you to this unknown God." First of all, he has a name. His name is Jehovah. And to introduce the Greeks to Jehovah, he goes back to Genesis, the very beginning. He begins by asserting that God is the creator, that God made everything in the world. In Acts 17, verse 24, he says to them, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." Now, in a private setting, he'd probably take his students to Genesis 1:1. So why don't we go to Genesis? We're going to crack open our Bibles. I've talked long enough without opening the book. But we all know this one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He might have pointed to other places in the Scriptures, and you don't need to go there, but in Isaiah 45, it says, "For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, He is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other." And then again in Psalm 89, it says, "The heavens are yours, the earth also is yours, the world and all that is in it. You have founded them." These were basic tenets of the Hebrew religion that the Greeks were not familiar with. And this is important because if the Lord is creator of the universe, this implies a certain amount of authority that He has. When we make things, we know how they work. We can tell them which way to go. If we're building a computer program, we can tell it exactly what we want it to do. And in the same way, Creator God has designed the world, and He set up the rules for the world. And just like today, back then there were different ideas about how the world came into existence. For instance, one group believed that the world was a chance combination of atoms. Does that sound familiar to anybody? That was that was one group. I'll think of it later. Another group believed in a kind of a pantheism. They believed that everything was God. This chair is part of God. This speaker is a manifestation of God. And that's not an uncommon philosophy either. That's, pervaded throughout history. We see it today in Eastern mysticism a lot, that everything is God. But we have a problem because when we're speaking about how man can know about God, man really cannot know where he stands in the grand scheme of things if he doesn't know the one who made the grand scheme of things. And so this is where Paul chooses to start. He starts by teaching that God is the creator. He's building the foundation for the story of redemption. So after he asserts that God is the creator, Paul moves on to teaching that God created man. In Acts 17, he says to them, "And He," speaking of God, "He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them." Having established that God is the creator, Paul would move on to teach that man has a relationship with his creator. So not only did God make the earth, but He also made man. And the way in which He made man is that He made man in His own image. And the reason that this is important is because we learn something about ourselves by learning about where we come from. If we know that we came from God, we can look in ourselves and we can not only learn more about ourselves, but we can learn something about God. We're made in God's image because not only are we physical beings, but we're also spiritual beings. And this is a characteristic, if we're looking at all of creation, this is a characteristic that is unique to humanity. We are spiritual creatures. And before the fall, because of this creator-created relationship, Adam and Eve enjoyed perfect fellowship with God. But unfortunately, we all know the story, and Paul would have taught this as well, that in the fall, in Genesis chapter 3, man's disobedience severed the relationship that he had with God. And in fact, if we turn over to chapter 3, we spoke about this a little bit last week. In the fall, we were cursed. And every generation of people since Adam has inherited the curse of sin, that we have this weakness, that we cannot possibly live in accordance with God's will because of that sin that lives inside of us. And this is the driving point that drives the story of redemption, this need for man to get back and be redeemed and be in relationship with God again. But in the same chapter, God gives Adam a promise. In verse 15, He says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel," speaking of the serpent. This is the first promise, and the idea of promise is going to carry us through the rest of the Old Testament. This promise that despite the curse that man is now under, that God is going to make a way to crush Satan's head, to crush the power of death, to eliminate the power of sin, and to restore that relationship that man and God have suffered the loss of. Paul would have also taught that now that this relationship has been severed, that man's purpose, the very purpose of life for every single human being, is to seek God. Again, in Acts 17, he says, "They were made that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us." So, having been disconnected from God, man's whole purpose in life is to seek to reestablish that relationship. There are a lot of things we can do in life. There are a lot of things that we can be successful at, that we can work at. There are many ways in which we can be considered successful, but ultimately we're going to be measured by whether we successfully reestablished that relationship with God through Christ Jesus. That's the gospel. That's what Paul was teaching these philosophers in Athens. And in demonstrating that during private time with his students, he might have pointed to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a wonderful exposition of how incredibly vain human life can be apart from God. In the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, verse 14, Solomon writing, he says, "I've seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind." Now, Solomon was the king who ruled Israel at the very height of the Israelite empire. You'll probably remember. He was the son of David. He was a man who was blessed beyond measure. He had greater wealth, greater intelligence than any other man of his time. And yet, in the final estimation, at the end of his life, as he struggled with sin throughout his life and how he had compromised throughout his life, he came to the conclusion that life was vain, that life had no meaning whatsoever. And if you read Ecclesiastes, that book is a downer. It is a serious downer, because he goes through every pursuit. He goes through learning, and he found learning. Pursuing learning was vain and a chasing after the wind. He goes through pleasure, and he decides that pleasure, he finds that seeking pleasure and your life in pleasure is vain and a chasing after the wind. It's useless. Riches, same thing. And at the very end of the book, he wraps it up like this. This is in chapter 12. "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." And Paul could point to this scripture and tell his students, everything is vanity. Our relationship with God has been broken because of man's disobedience at the foundation of the race. We have one purpose in life, and that's to fear God and keep his commandments. In verse 14 in Ecclesiastes 12, it says, "For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." So here the promise of judgment. And the promise of judgment came about when sin was introduced into the world. And indeed, we didn't really talk about Noah, and we will. That's part of the story too. But Noah was a foreshadowing of the judgment that would come. In the flood, God preserved Noah and his family, the people of God, but with a promise. And the promise was, this time judgment's by water, next time it's by fire. There will be another judgment. And the rest of the word looks forward to that judgment, but also the salvation from that judgment that God is going to provide for his people. So those are the patriarchs. That's the early history of the Bible. Now, up to this point, then, Greek students would know enough to be able to join the class with their Hebrew compatriots, or however you want to call them, classmates. Because the Jews already had a certain knowledge of God. The Jews would have been raised with the Hebrew Scriptures, and even though they didn't understand the teaching about Jesus, they would be familiar with the idea of God as the creator, the fall, sinful man, those sorts of things. And so the following points come out of Paul's teaching to the Jews in Antioch. And with the Jews, Paul focuses on Israel's ministry, because Israel's the nation that the Lord chose to bring the truth of God to the entire world. That was the purpose of the nation of Israel, to bring what in some places is called the oracles of God to humanity. And he starts with Abraham. Abraham was the first patriarch, and in Genesis 12, God makes the first of a series of promises to Abraham. And this promise is going to carry through until the time of Messiah. This is Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 2. The Lord speaking to Abraham. He says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now the Lord is speaking to a man of no repute from Ur of the Chaldees, the area of the world today that we know as Iraq, Persian Gulf area. This man was not a Hebrew. He was not a God-fearer. He was a Gentile. And yet the Lord makes this promise to him that all of the families of the earth shall be blessed through him. And at this point, it's a little hazy, but the Lord clarifies that a few chapters later in chapter 15. Verse 5. Now, Abraham had understood that promise to be the promise of a son. Back then, if you didn't have kids, you were a total loser, because everything was about passing down generation to generation, establishing a livelihood. And it was an incredible shame, both for a man and a woman, but especially for a woman, if you didn't have any children. People assumed that you were cursed in some way. And Abraham and Sarah had not yet had children. And in chapter 12, Abraham receives this promise from the Lord, and in chapter 15, still nothing. And Abraham's like, all right, Lord, what's the deal? What's going on? So the Lord confirms the promise to him. In verse 5, he says, Then he brought him outside and said, Look now toward heaven, and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Not only is this verse important because the Lord Jehovah is confirming his promise to Abraham, but he's adding a layer of information now. He's saying that I haven't reneged on my promise. And not only that, but this is the first time that we see that salvation comes by grace through faith. In the verse where he says, And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. Years and years later, Paul is going to point back to this verse and argue from this verse that the promise started in Abraham, that salvation would come by grace through God's choice. And again, if we flip over in Genesis 17, verse 6, the Lord ups the ante again. He makes his promise to Abraham everlasting and permanent. He says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. He's making the promise, and he's making it everlasting. This is not something that I'll go back on, and we'll see why this is important in a minute, because when the nation of Israel is formed, they have a covenant as well, a covenant formed under the law, but it's a covenant that's conditional upon their obedience. This covenant is conditioned upon nothing more than the word of the Lord, and that's why this one is going to stick. Also in verse 19 of that same chapter, the Lord confirms that the promise would be transferred not through Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn, but through Isaac. He says, "Then God said, 'No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac.'" And this is in response to Abraham saying to the Lord, "Lord, let's let Ishmael be the chosen one." He says that in the verse prior. Why can't let Ishmael live before you? But we'll remember that Ishmael was not the child of the promise. Ishmael was the workaround that Sarah came up with. She was like, "Well, let's have a kid this way. Here, have my handmaid." Lord says, no, we're not compromising. We're going to stick with the child of the promise. And Isaac is going to be the child of promise. And he says, "I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant and with his descendants after him." So he promises now that the covenant is going to be passed on to Isaac. The Lord confirms that promise over in chapter 26, verse 4. Speaking to Isaac, "And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So what we're going to see here is we're going to see the promise of the Lord, and it's going to be narrowed down. It starts with Abraham. It's moving up a generation to Isaac. From Isaac, it's going to move up another generation. And this promise, we find, is the promise of the Messiah. We haven't gotten there yet, but this is the promise of the Messiah. And it started way back with Abraham, where he says, "In you the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then he confirms the covenant as everlasting. This covenant is signed, sealed, and delivered. Nothing can cancel this. He confirms it to Jacob. The next generation, Isaac's son Jacob, he had two sons, Esau and Jacob. The Lord again chooses Jacob. Now this is the third generation in a row where the Lord has chosen the person through whom the promise would travel. Okay, so he chose Abraham. Abraham was a Gentile. He did not inherit it because of his ethnicity. He was chosen by God. Abraham has some sons. Ishmael, the oldest, Isaac, the youngest. God chooses the youngest, which was against the cultural norms of that day. So we see the will of the Lord just moving this promise forward, generation through generation. The next generation, the very same thing happens. So Isaac has two sons. He has Esau, the oldest, and Jacob. The Lord chooses Jacob, the younger. Okay? This tells us something about our God. Our God is not a respecter of persons. Our God chooses those people whose heart are after him. And through Jacob, who will be Israel, he changes his name to Israel, he delivers the promise, the first specific promise about Messiah in Genesis chapter 49, as Israel is blessing his sons. So here the story is, they went through the famine, Joseph has moved his family into Egypt now, and Israel is getting ready to die, and at the end of his life, he is sitting there blessing his sons. And in chapter 49, verse 10, he speaks to Judah. He says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of all the people." Obedience of the people, excuse me. Now when you hear the word Shiloh, your ears should perk up, because Shiloh almost always refers to the Messiah. This is the first direct reference to Messiah. And we see again this line, the messianic line, come from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Now it's settling into one of the tribes. There are 12 tribes. There could have been any of the tribes. Judah was not the first tribe. I believe Naphtali was the oldest son. Messiah did not come through the oldest son. He'd come through Judah. And the name of Judah means praise. How appropriate is that? So the promise continues. Incredible. So imagine, let's press the pause button for a second, because I know this is kind of heavy. I imagine Paul saying to the Jews, we've been living with these scriptures for thousands of years, and only now is this being revealed to us. Can you imagine their reaction to that? How this is what I was experiencing, and I have the whole story, So, once he calls on Judah, now we move into the era where the nation of Israel, as a nation, the 12 tribes, become the vehicle through which the Lord will teach more about his Messiah, provide more specific prophecies about him, and the rest. So God had told Abraham that his people would be enslaved by a nation that was not their own, and that comes to pass. Israel is enslaved. And Jehovah calls Moses to lead the nation out of captivity. He establishes a covenant with Moses, and this is in Exodus 19, if you want to turn there. Now this is important. This is the point at where it's important to remember that the Lord's covenant with Abraham was everlasting. It would be permanent. The covenant that he's about to make with Moses is not permanent. It's temporary. The purpose of this agreement is to lead people to Christ, is to point the way to Christ. And in 19 verse 5 it says, this is the Lord telling Moses what to tell the people. He says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." But note how he let out in that agreement, "if you will indeed obey my voice." So there's a condition attached to this. There was no condition with Abraham's covenant. He said, "I am going to bless the peoples of the world through you." But no such treatment for the covenant in Moses. Now, what is the covenant, what does the agreement with Moses consist of? So in this agreement, he receives the 10 Commandments, which is in the next chapter, Exodus 20. Israel receives the judgments, which are like the moral rules of the nation, and they receive the ordinances, which is how the Lord instructed them to worship him. And so under this covenant, this temporary covenant, the Lord sets up a system of worship and a system of, like a political structure that was not headed by a king, it was by priests, headed by priests, in which Israel could have relationship with God. And remember, in the end, that's what this is all about. This is about closing the gap in the relationship between mankind and God. As I mentioned, this covenant is temporary. And in the New Testament and in his writings, Paul describes this covenant as a tutor that leads us to Christ. And that is the key to understanding this piece of the story. This was never meant to be permanent. And when Christ comes, this covenant lapses, it expires. Because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the things having to do with the temple, all the things having to do with the feasts and festivals and all of that. This system of worship points to Christ, and it highlights the fact that there is a separation between man and God. When God gave Moses instructions for the tabernacle, only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. The rest of the people were kept out. This not only did this highlight the separation between man and God, but it also pointed ahead to Christ, who would be our ultimate high priest. The system of worship consists of the necessity of a blood sacrifice, which would again point forward to Christ. And can you imagine Paul just pointing out all these things in the Hebrew Bible? Guys, this is him speaking to his students. High priest, blood sacrifice, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. The mercy seat, which was the kofar, God's promise to cover the sins of his people. So all of these things were set up, as it says in the book of Hebrews, as a shadow of the things to come. So after Moses, moving on, Yeshua, leads Israel to the land of promise to claim their inheritance. But they only claim the inheritance in part. They won't enjoy the full inheritance until Christ comes again. But because the covenant with Moses was conditional upon Israel's obedience, they had to be good boys and girls in order to maintain that fellowship with God. And that was the problem. Because we all know, because of what we've inherited from Adam, that we are not always good boys and girls. And we cannot possibly always be good boys and girls. And so Israel fell into a period of time where their relationship with God was hot and cold. It was spotty. This is the period of history that's cataloged in the book of Judges, where there were these leaders who would come, and the Israelites would get all fired up about God, and they'd be like, all right, I'm leaving that, and I'm not going to worship Baal anymore. I promise, I'm not going to the meeting with Baal anymore. Going to Jehovah's meeting. Well, then his friends would come. Hey, man, we're going over the Baal worship. You want to come with us? He's like, no, man, sorry. I made a promise to Jehovah. And there was this on again, off again. That was through the whole book of Judges. And eventually, Israel asks for a king at the end of that period. They asked, the prophet Samuel was the judge over them, and they asked for a king. God never intended the Israelites to be ruled over by an earthly king. They were always to wait for the godly king to come, the Messiah. But Israel asked, and eventually the Lord relents, and he allows them to have a king. And Saul is named king. And Saul does well. He's anointed of the Lord, and he does well in the beginning. But he doesn't finish very well. And in fact, the turning point in Saul's life, which also points to Christ, is the time when Saul, as king, takes over the job as priest. Things weren't going the way that Saul wanted them to go. And so he took over the office of priest. And there's only one who can be both king and priest, and that's Christ. So Saul had totally walked over the line. And so the Lord says, you're done. I'm sorry, I'm done with you. And at that point, the Lord instructs Samuel to go and anoint David king of Israel. So even in Saul's disobedience, we see Christ projected forward, that there would be one, and we'll hear later in a psalm that David writes, that he is both the high priest and the king of righteousness. Let's go to 1 Samuel. We're going to pick up with David. Another problem with Saul is that Saul, as king, was from the family of Benjamin. And in Genesis, if you remember, when Israel blessed Judah, he said that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Now, the scepter, of course, is an image of power, of royalty, things like that. But he didn't say Benjamin was a totally different family. And so when Israel was to have a king, the king had to be from the tribe of Judah. So Saul was illegitimate to begin with, in part because he was from the tribe of Benjamin. That didn't fit into the messianic line. However, I have good news for you. David is from Judah. So the Lord fixes this. In 1 Samuel 16, he tells Samuel to go and anoint David. And again, David was the youngest of his brothers. So here again we see the Lord exercising his sovereign choice in choosing the man, as it says, he describes as a man after his own heart in chapter 13. And David's life becomes a picture of Christ's earthly ministry. Because even though he's anointed as king, Saul is still on the throne. And David is the rightful king, just as Jesus was the rightful king when he came into the earth. And yet Satan was still the prince of this world, as he's referred to. So while Christ came as king, he was not recognized as king. And in the same way, David was not recognized as the king at first. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, at this point, fast forward a little bit, David is now king. And David has been blessed. He's reflecting on how good the Lord has been to him. And he decides he wants to do something for God, which is natural. I mean, that makes sense. At the beginning of the chapter it says, "Now it came to pass when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies all around, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, 'See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains.'" He didn't like the fact that the ark of the Lord, which represented the presence of Jehovah, he didn't like the fact that it was, he's like, we need some nicer digs for the Lord. So Nathan says, go do all that's in your heart. The Lord's with you. Go for it. But the Lord is not in favor of this. And so the Lord shuts him down. He says, no, I don't want you to do that. But then he makes David this incredible promise. And here we pick up again with the promise. The promise has kind of been subtle for the last couple hundred years. And now it pops back up on the radar here again in verse 11. It said, also the Lord tells you that he will make you, speaking to David, he will make you a house as in a royal house, a dynasty. When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So now the Lord makes this incredible promise to David. And this, like the promise to Abraham, is a promise forever. It's an everlasting promise. That David's family and his lineage would have the throne of Israel. And this tells us that now the Lord, we knew that the Lord anointed David, but now Jehovah has chosen the line of David, so it's getting narrower. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, help me out here. Judah, David. We're narrowing it down. There are only so many options now for where Messiah is going to come. And he says, I'm going to establish your throne forever. Now, I mean, that'd be wonderful. That's a good thing. Like Abraham's promise, it's an everlasting promise. But, I mean, maybe Nathan heard something wacky. Maybe he had something, some particularly spicy falafel that day, and he heard something that wasn't true. No, that's always possible. And the naysayers will always say that. But the fact that Messiah will come through David's line is all over the prophets. So let's look at a couple of those places. And you don't have to go there. Amos chapter 9, verse 11, speaking of Israel's eventual restoration to the land, says, on that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5, it says, I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. We're more familiar with the next two prophecies in Isaiah. Let's go there. Isaiah chapter 9. And remember, all these things were in print more than 100 years before Jesus was born. This is incredible. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government, kingdom, will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. I love that verse. The zeal of the Lord of hosts, the sovereign choice of the Lord, is going to put a king on David's throne again. Not conditional upon anybody's behavior, as was under the system of sacrifices and religiosity that was established under Moses, but under God's sovereign choice. In Isaiah chapter 11, flipping over to the next page, it says, "There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse." Who was Jesse? David's father. Hello. "And a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord." There's that branch again. Jeremiah talked about that branch. "I will raise to David a branch of righteousness." That's a figure, this offshoot. It speaks of the Messiah as well. And then from David's own pen, Psalm 110. Let's jump over there. Remember how I talked about the Messiah being the only one who could be both king and priest? Well, we'll see that here in Psalm 110. Jesus taught from this psalm, so this will be very familiar. Verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." And Jesus pointed out, how can David call this other person Lord? And he was pointing out that even though Messiah was referred to as the son of David, and typically in that culture, sons would pay homage to their fathers, David was calling this offspring of his Lord, emphasizing the fact that this was indeed the king to come, the Messiah king. Down in verse 4 of that same psalm, it says, "The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." At this point, I kind of feel like I realize that you could take like any one of these things and talk for a long time. I mean, this is just incredible stuff. But I like to step back and see the big picture because it's just relentless. It's just relentless. The testimony and the promise of the Lord throughout the ages. And here it says, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So he's referring to a king, but he's also saying to the king, you are a priest forever. And as we said earlier, the only one who will be able to be both king and priest is the Messiah. He's the great high priest who represents the people to God and the God to people, but he's also the righteous king who will execute judgment and on whose shoulders the government of David will rest. So again, this is pointing forward to Messiah. There's absolutely 100% agreement in the prophets that the Messiah will come from David's line. So that being said, let's go to Matthew. What family did Jesus come from? Shock and horror. David's family. Now, I think that this is kind of familiar to us, but I think it's really fruitful to refresh our memories about this because the story that we carry with us is an incredible story. You can't make this stuff up. You really cannot. The very first verse of Matthew says, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." So what? So this guy's descended from David. But then that descendant of David goes on to live the most incredible life that any person has ever lived. And if that weren't enough, that same person who came from the line of David, who lived the most incredible life, was executed we didn't even go there. I mean, that's like the second half of what I wanted to talk about, how the execution is foretold, and the suffering is foretold, and the resurrection is foretold. That same man came from the family of David, just as the prophecy said he would. You can't ignore that. You can't ignore that. you can't help getting a little fired up about that. That's pretty cool. And so that we know, just a little historical note, in Jesus' day, concerning the genealogies and everything, genealogies were, very important to the Jewish people. You were only a Jew if you were a Jew by birth. And so, in an effort to maintain their national integrity, they kept very meticulous genealogical records. You'll remember when we studied in Nehemiah, people whose records got lost, like they couldn't prove that they descended from a particular tribe, especially in the case of the priests, if they couldn't prove on paper that they were Levites, they were kicked out of the priesthood. It was that serious. And so, knowing that, the genealogies were actually a matter of public record that were kept in the temple. So anybody who thought, this guy's not from the line of David, they could have just walked down to Jerusalem, checked out, all right, hey, I want the genealogy for, let's go by Jesse's family, flip through it. They could have proven on paper, this guy is not from the line of David. And you'll notice that nobody argued with him that he was from the line of David, because it was a matter of public record. So what? Like I said at the beginning, I don't want this to be merely an academic exercise. I enjoy academic exercises, as you can probably tell. But this is not just about filling our heads with a lot of knowledge that you can go to parties and impress your friends with. This is about knowing where we came from. This is about knowing our story. We, most of us anyway, are not Jewish. We were brought into the family of faith under that initial promise that was given to Abraham, through your family and through your seed, all the families of the world will be blessed. That's us. We're the families of the earth. And we've received the blessing of Jehovah through Jesus, his son, according to what was foretold in his word. That's awesome stuff. So, we were talking about this at Bible study the other night. When it comes to passing on the legacy, when it comes to teaching our sons, our daughters, our friends about this gospel, this good news that we've received, think of it like you're passing on a heritage. This is heritage that has been received over thousands of years, literally. And I'm not always the one who's like the first to run out there and say, Jesus loves you. That's just not me. But can I have a conversation about some of this stuff? Yeah, let's go. Let's talk about it. It's written down. So, just food for thought. The other thing that to keep in mind is, as it talks about Messiah in the Old Testament, he is going to execute judgment and righteousness on the earth. Not yet. It's coming. But knowing that he's going to be sitting on the judgment seat. He is going to decide who the faithful are and who the unfaithful are. That spurs us as well. It's that promise of Noah. There was judgment first by water. There would be judgment again by fire. And whereas I'm going to assume that most of us here have pledged our allegiance to the King, for those who have not, that's the expectation they have. That one day they're going to come face to face with our King. And he's going to ask, so what do you say? What confession about me did you make? Having read the prophecies, if they have, over thousands of years, having heard the testimony of faithful Christians, what's your answer? So let that be with us as we go out from this place. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you that, as it's said in your word, you will not relent. You don't give up. Lord, I thank you that throughout the centuries, your message has been present and has been consistent and has never changed. Lord, I thank you that you love us enough to make yourself known. As the word says, this wasn't done in a corner. This has been out and in the open. Your ministry was always out and in the open. And Lord, as we digest the truth of your word, Lord, I pray that it would transform our lives, that we would turn to you if we need to repent, that we would change our minds about you. And if not, Lord, that then we would be encouraged. If we don't need that, then that we would be encouraged by the fact that your testimony is sure, that your testimony is historical, that we don't place our faith in myths or legends. We place our faith in the very word of the eternal God. We pray these things in Jesus' name.